Well, it looks like the long-awaited battletome supplement for Ironjawz is finally here. So let's get into what this new rules update brings. If you want to read the specific rules for yourself, I put a link to the rules PDF in the description. But in this video, I'm doing something a bit different from my usual formula, and I'll be going over my first impressions for these rules, and how I think this will shake up the Age of Sigmar meta. But as a preface for this discussion, I think it's important to talk about where Ironjawz stand as an army currently. If you've kept up with competitive Ironjawz strategies, then you would know that pretty much every Ironjawz list since the release of their 3rd edition battletome has boiled down to using a Megaboss on Maw-Krusha as your general, 2 to 3 War Chanters to support your army, a bunch of Gore-Gruntas, and then maybe some Artboys since they're a cheap screen, which is always nice to have, and maybe a weird knob shaman. Finally, all of this would be in the Bloodtooth's subfaction to make your Gore-Gruntas even better. This formula has been the baseline for most Ironjawz lists people would play since Gore-Gruntas are just the best unit to use, and that kind of list is the best way to support them. Furthermore, Ironjawz just didn't have much options to pick from to begin with. But with the announcement of the range practically doubling in size, it got a lot of people like me excited for more list diversity. But new rules don't always guarantee successful army builds, so let's get into the Warscrolls and see if it's enough to make a change. To start, alongside the new models, Artboys did get a Warscroll rewrite to go along with their fantastic new sculpts. Before the update, they came in units of 5 for 80 points, and filled the role of screen since they were the cheapest battle line unit in the army. However, now you'll need to pay a hefty 220 points for a block of 10, and their new role seems to be that they're sort of an Anvil unit, given they have a base 3-up save, which is the best out of any troop in the army, and they have a solid wounds to point ratio. My first and immediate thought on these is that looking at most units with similar stats and role, like Saurus Warriors and Chaos Warriors, you will notice that they often come with some powerful ability that will help them stay alive alongside their 3-up save. For Saurus Warriors, they have Scaly Skin that reduces incoming damage by 1, and Chaos Warriors have a 5-up ward against mortal wounds, and they're often given the Nurgle keyword for -1 to wound against melee attacks. But in the case of Artboys, they don't get any of these things, so they don't quite meet the threshold where I could call them a true Anvil unit. Now, of course, the one thing they have over some of the more traditional Anvils is all the cool Ironjawz buffs they can gain, like the War Chanters +1 damage, and Mighty Destroyers for a free hero phase move. So overall, they seem okay enough to bring a unit in a list. They're kind of riding that line where they're not doing any one job especially well. So I wouldn't be surprised if they came down 20 points or so, since they seem a tad overcosted, especially when comparing their costs to the aforementioned Anvil units. But even ignoring all of that, the fact that they have a completely different role will absolutely shake up Ironjawz lists, due to the fact that they're no longer the cheapest non-conditional battle line unit. Now, that role goes to Auric Brutes, weirdly enough. And for the previously mentioned stapled Bloodtooths list, this isn't too big of a loss, since your Gore-Gruntas become battle line in that subfaction anyways, so you have your battle line requirement already figured out. But it does mean that you're going to have to look elsewhere for screens, and it looks like your best choices are the 2 Ironjawz Underworld's warbands, Iron Skull's Boys, and Morgoth's Crushas, both of which cost 80 points, the same as old Artboys. So if you were smart and liked running a couple of screens in your Grunta-heavy lists already, you probably won't have to change much around in your list, and if you don't already have these units, they're worth the consideration. The big downside, though, is that both of these units are no longer being sold by Games Workshop, and are pretty hard to get your hands on nowadays, with scalpers charging some exorbitant prices. My best advice would be, if you want to run these units, just convert some up, rather than pay quadruple of their original MSRP. They don't really look that different from the rest of the Ironjawz units, so it wouldn't even be that hard to do. Now, of course, to support the previously mentioned Artboys, you could bring the new Artboy Big Boss. What he does is he can issue Rally twice as long as both times it's to an Artboy unit, and he gives Artboys a 5-up Rally. Additionally, he makes the forgettable Shield Bash ability of Artboys slightly better. Overall, while this guy is cheap, I'm not really impressed. For just a little extra points, you can get an Orruk Megaboss who outclasses this guy in basically every way. Since the Megaboss can issue any command twice instead of just Rally, and can issue it to any Ironjawz unit, not just Artboys. And like I mentioned before, I'm not too sold on the idea of bringing more than one unit of Artboys. On top of that, the Megaboss is also more durable, damaging, and can fight on death. So unless you really like the model, don't buy the new Artboy Big Boss. The other foot hero that came with this update is Zogrok Anvil Smasher, who is accompanied by Clonk the Anvil Squig. He has 2 weapons he can choose from, which affect how his abilities work. His one weapon is a ward-smashing choppa, which sounds good at first given how prevalent wards are in Age of Sigmar. That is, of course, until you read the rule for it, and see he only removes wards if he rolls a 6 to hit with his weapon, and he only has 2 attacks with the weapon, so you only have a 30% chance of removing a ward when he fights, which is disappointing. It would have been really nice if Ironjawz got access to some cool utility, like consistent ward removal, since in general, the army is severely lacking utility of any kind. On the other hand, his other ability on his Warscroll lets you pick a nearby friendly unit, and on a 4-up give them mortal wounds on 6s to hit. But if you take the Gruntatong's melee weapon, which you will, given the ward-smashing Choppa sucks, you get to add 2 to the roll. So basically it's on a 2-up, not a 4-up. While this is a solid bonus, the immediate issue this guy faces is how he compares with a War Chanter, since War Chanters are the gold standard support unit for this army. And in the end, it's not even a close comparison. The War Chanter just outranks this guy every time. You could make the argument that you could use this guy in tandem with a War Chanter to buff the same unit, which is true, but quite frankly, I'd much rather bring more War Chanters. Violent Fury for +1 damage, and their unique beats are just too good to pass up. Overall, I'm not impressed. He could afford to be cheaper in points. Now for some of the new foot troops, and we got 2 options, both of which can be built from the same box. These being Brute Ragers and Weird Brute Rekkas. Both having a 5-up save, as they have given up wearing as much armor for more mobility, getting the ability to run and charge, which is a fine ability on its own, but it's especially powerful for Ironjawz, since they can issue the command to auto-run 6 inches multiple times in the same phase. So in total, they can move 4 inches in the hero phase with Mighty Destroyers, move 4 inches plus a 6-inch run in the movement phase, for a total of 14 inches of movement before charging, making them decently fast even compared to Gorgruntas, which move a total of 18 inches with Mighty Destroyers. So that, alongside their solid damage output, makes them seem like a solid unit that actually has a chance to see competitive play, and won't be immediately outclassed by Gorgruntas, which was the issue Orruk Brutes have classically had, since they're so dang slow. Additionally, they both have the Brute keyword, so they both benefit from the battle traits from Dechappa's subfaction. The last similarity between these units is that neither have the ability to become battle line, and are relatively cheap units, at 100 points and 125 points. Because of this, the way that seems best to use them is to reinforce them once so your buffs have a little more impact on them, and you get more meaningful combat activations. Although it is a bit of a shame you can't double reinforce them, that would have been really good to have. Now the obvious question is, which unit is the better choice to build? For differences, Ragers are your more standard damage dealers, doing solid damage pretty much no matter what their target is. And as a side note, the Gorhakkas feel like the best weapons for them to wield on average. It's when you get to the extremes of the save spectrum that they start to get outclassed by the other options. But the Weird Brute Rekkas are great for clearing hordes, getting exploding 6s to hit against units with lots of models, and a 5-up ward while in combat, which helps them stick around when surrounded by enemy hordes. For first impressions, I'm a bigger fan of Ragers by a small margin, since their damage output against most targets is better on a per-point basis. But Weird Brutes still have their place in a brute-heavy, foot-slogging Ironjawz list, because their damage output against stuff like zombies is crazy. With just a little bit of support, they could take out around 40 zombies in just one swing. I just wouldn't run as many of these as I would Ragers. Alright, now for the main event a lot of players were excited for, the Big Pigs, of which there are 3 variants. You can sort of think of each unit like an upgraded version of the previous, with more abilities at the cost of more points. Let's start with the basic pig, the Maw-Grunta Gouger. Overall, I like this unit for the simple fact it's a mobile, cheap monster. Given how impactful Roar is, having something that can use Roar that isn't your Maw Crusher is just useful to have up your sleeve, since you don't always want to commit your Maw Crusher given how valuable it is. Additionally, it has decent stats, so even in our previously mentioned go-to Ironjawz list, swapping out 3 Gore-Gruntas for a single Maw-Grunta Gouger is a worthwhile trade for the utility. Even on top of that, it has an interesting mechanic called Unstoppable Momentum, where its momentum goes up whenever it runs or charges, but decreases over time, so you'll want to make sure it's running or charging every turn you can. And the more momentum the unit builds, the better its movement and damage output becomes. This is all a bit complicated, but it's an interesting spin on the use of damage tables. Lastly, it has a unique monstrous action that can make a unit with a wounds characteristic of 1 or 2 strike last if this unit charged, and rolls a dice lower than its momentum value. This is really niche, but like I said, you'll be probably using Roar more than anything else with this. In its current iteration, I have to imagine it will see play at the very least as a one-of in some Bloodtooths lists. Now for a step up at 270 points, we have the Maw-Grunta with Haka Crew. For the extra 90 points, you get everything the Gouger has, but 2 more wounds, an additional attack profile, and a different monstrous action, where if you're by an enemy unit with a wounds characteristic of 4 or less, then you roll a dice, and if you roll less than your momentum score, then you get to do some damage, and then make a free flying charge move. Although the rule for the charge move is a bit janky. Instinctively, you may think you can just go ahead and make a free charge, like the Ogre Maw Tribe's Unstoppable Charge ability. But it's worded slightly differently, and rules as written, it technically doesn't allow you to make a charge if there are still enemy units within 3 inches after you do the mortal wounds. However, this honestly just seems like a rules mistake, and I'd be willing to bet that they will fix it to allow you to charge even if you're in combat range, just like how ogres do. So for this discussion, I'll be treating it this way. But overall, I'm still not impressed. I'd just rather go with the budget option Big Pig for better overall value per point. But it's not unusable since the monstrous action utility is not something the army otherwise has access to. And lastly, for a whopping 380 points, you can upgrade this pig into the hero version, the Tusk Boss on Maw-Grunta. For the extra 110 points over the previous version, you get 2 more attacks, a 3-up save instead of a 4-up, and if this unit makes a charge, all of your other big pigs get to re-roll charges for the rest of the phase. Lastly, if this model is your general, the basic Maw-Grunta Gougers become battle line. So, this unit is a hero monster that sort of wants to be your general, immediately meaning it's competing with the Mega Boss on Maw Crusher for this exact role. And quite frankly, I'd rather take the Maw Crusher every time. Even though the Maw Crusher is more expensive, you get so much more value. You get better stats, the ability to fly, the ability to issue commands 3 times, which is one of the best parts about Ironjawz, and access to Ironjawz enhancements. That's right, weirdly enough, the new Pig Hero doesn't actually get access to any of the cool command traits and artifacts, because they specify that the hero has to be a Mega Boss, or an Ironjawz wizard, so it's stuck using the generic enhancements, which is a huge loss. The new Artboy Big Boss also suffers from this issue, which is just another point against using it. So overall, the Maw Crusher is an extremely valuable unit to have, and this new monster hero just isn't enough to dethrone our cabbage-shaped friend, in my opinion. For the same reason, I'm not sold on something like a Maw Grunta heavy Ironjawz army, which I know some people were excited about. It just doesn't make sense to me over the other options Ironjawz has. Speaking of pig spam armies, alongside this update, in the new book, Dawnbringers, Reign of the Brute, we got an Army of Renown for Ironjawz. Armies of Renown are a new thing in Age of Sigmar, where you can play a specific version of an army with a bunch of list building restrictions to get access to different allegiance abilities. But sadly, this Army of Renown just isn't very good. I won't get into too much detail, but the upsides just don't make up for the downsides. Taking this Army of Renown means you can only use Gore-Gruntas and any kind of Maw Gruntas in your army, meaning no War Chanters, which give out one of the best offensive buffs in the game. It also means you don't get smashing and bashing, so no cheating at combat activations. You don't get Mighty Destroyers, so your units are going to be going much slower and have less versatility. And lastly, you don't get the Ironjawz Wah. So basically, you give up on every good part about Ironjawz for some, quite frankly, unappealing new minor bonuses. Just don't use the Army of Renown rules. It's like shooting yourself in the foot, competitively speaking, and the new rules are pretty boring. Playing regular old Ironjawz is still the way to go. But that's pretty much it for actual rules. Now, how can we use these new rules to make some interesting lists? Firstly, I think we should adapt the classic Bloodtooths list since it's been proven that it works well already. This list here simply makes the changes I've previously mentioned. We have our standard set of Ironjawz heroes, a Maw Crusher, some War Chanters, and a Weird Knob, with a bunch of Gore-Gruntas for them to buff. But, new to the list, we have the Underworld's Warbands to act as cheap screens, and we have the Maw Grunta Gouger to give us some utility with its access to Roar, Smash to Rubble, and its unique monstrous action for potential strike last on the opponent. Quite frankly, I'd be surprised if a lot of existing Ironjawz players don't start shifting to lists that look a little more like this here, since it doesn't require many of the new units, and it's the kind of list that most people are used to playing. But if you're just tired of the same old Bloodtooths lists that everybody has been using on end since the start of 3rd edition, let's do something a bit spicy and lean into the new Brute units, and use the subfaction the Choppas, which allows our War Chanters to give +1 damage to 3 units, as long as the units we pick are Brutes or Ardboys to receive the buff. This is my first iteration of something I'd want to try out if I had the models. A bunch of Brutes of every flavor, which can almost all be buffed at the same time by the War Chanters, and a Mega Boss on Maw Crusher General to give out some much needed command point value. But if you want to try a list with only non-cavalry units for a real different style of Ironjawz list, you could try something like this, cutting the Maw Crusher, which gives you more points to work with, meaning you can have 2 Mega Bosses on foot, a Utility Pig, and since the points worked out the way they did, I threw in a Shaman for access to spells and unbinds. Although, in the end, these are just my theory-crafted lists of what seems good to me on paper. For actual statistics and player results, we'll have to wait and see how it all pans out once people actually start playing with these units in tournament settings. But that'll cover it for my thoughts on the new Ironjawz stuff. And overall, I'm happy with how it all turned out. It's nice to see this army really get fleshed out after relying on so few units for so long. If you enjoyed the video, consider checking out my other content. I have a fully fleshed out guide on Kharadron Overlords and Osiarch Bone Reapers, with a video on Gloomspite Gits coming soon. And if you want to give some support more directly to me, consider checking out my Patreon. And special thanks to Travis for being the highest tier Patreon. Your support is greatly appreciated. Also, feel free to let me know what you think about the Ironjawz update in the comments below. I'm curious to hear what the general reception of these new rules is. That's it from me. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you here in the next one.